Hi, and welcome to Civs 101, the show where historians discuss Sid Meier's Civilization series. I'm your host, Bob Whitaker. On today's episode, we'll be looking at the German Civ, led in Civilization 6 by Frederick Barbarossa. Like a lot of the Civs that we've covered early on in Civs 101, the Germans are one of the original 14 Civs, and have been in the series for the past 3 decades. However, as Sid Meier recently revealed in his memoir, the Germans were nearly replaced at the last minute by the Turks because of long-standing issues related to modern history and censorship in Germany. In a lot of ways, when it comes to studying the high-wire act of depicting difficult historical topics in video games, there's no better case study than looking at how the Civilization series has and has not depicted German history and its leaders. To help me better understand the issues related to depicting German history and popular culture, and to consider the Germans in Civilization 6 more specifically, I've invited onto the show Dr. Jeremy Best. Dr. Best is an assistant professor of modern Germany at Iowa State University. He earned his PhD from the University of Maryland at College Park. His book, entitled Heavenly Fatherland, was published by the University of Toronto Press in 2021. Jeremy's newest project will consider the history of wargaming and its relationship with Holocaust memory. Jeremy, welcome to Civs 101.
Thanks for having me. I'm so glad to be here, Bob. I'm really excited to talk about this. If you had told 10-year-old me that he was going to get to, be on the radio, I would have known podcasting, to talk about a game he was playing however many years later. I don't know what I would have thought. It's pretty exciting to be doing this, honestly.
Awesome. Well, welcome. First thing, I ask this question of everybody who comes on the show. Mm-hmm. What's your experience with the Civilization series, and what do you make of the way that it presents the past?
Sure. My experience, I already sort of said, I think I played Civilization 1 on a I think it was on an Apple 2GS. Maybe it may have been a 486 IBM. I think my brother had got it, and I played that game pretty hard and stuck with it through. I don't think I spent much time on 2, but 3, 4, 5, and now 6 have been sort of staple games for me. It took me a little while to get started on 6 because I had to wait for the opportunity to get a better computer, honestly, because I had been working on the same computer I bought right when I was writing my dissertation. I got a new computer, and so I've been grinding on a very incapable computer for a long time. So I've been playing it for a long time. How it represents history, it is frustrating and wonderful in lots of different ways, right? I mean, it is not a historical simulation, but they work so hard to achieve something that might be called authenticity or accuracy. That absolutely the game is it shows you things, and there are things I learn about history through the game. They're usually I often think of them as more trivia items, but still very interesting. Yeah.
It's interesting. We've got kind of I think I'm in the Middle Ages here with Germany, and just starting on a random map. The difficulty level, I think, is at Prince or Warlord or something like that. I'm just kind of messing around. Yep. And, I think that the series for Germany, it's kind of had this long-standing issue, which, going back to the top, mentioning how Sid Meier almost kept the German Civ out of the original game. It's hard to believe, but it really was something that he considered. And, with the history of Germany and the Germans in the Civilization series, there's obviously an attempt in the game to avoid any association with the Second World War or with Adolf Hitler or the Nazi Party. And this also, though, coming from a series that included people like Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong, in the original game. So I'm wondering, given this long history now, 30 plus years of the Germans in this series, what do you make of how Germany has been depicted in the series? And then what do you make about Civ 6 and the way that it depicts the Germans?
So I think, first of all, I'm not fully convinced. I mean, yes, on the surface, they have tried to avoid too close an association with the Second World War, with the Nazi regime, and by extension, the crimes of the Nazi regime, the Holocaust particularly. But I did some looking back to remind myself, in Civilization 3, the specialty unit that the Germans get includes a Panzer. In Civilization 4, it includes a Panzer. In Civilization 5, it includes the Tiger. And in Civilization 6, it's the U-boat. And it's not clear, the U-boat is sort of mapped onto the early, and the way submarines are handled in the game, it's sort of, they're sort of splitting the difference between your sort of 1910s and 1940s submarines. Before the upgrade to the nuclear submarine. But in all of those, if you look at the unit picture for the Civilization 5, it's clearly a Tiger tank. In 4, it's very much looks like a Panther tank. In 3, this is interesting. Some of this is the quality of graphics. It's less and less detailed, but it is absolutely. It looks different, and it may or may not be. You can look at people who are much more interested in these details than I am on the internet, and they'll say, "I think it's a Panzer III." And so there you go, right? So they're still connecting to the world wars. They cannot and will not avoid it. In addition to that, I think that and this is not just think, but in earlier games, some of the built-in or expansion scenarios include a Second World War, and so there's a decision, I think, made by the game's creators at different points to avoid looking too much like they want people to cosplay as the Germans in World War II, but also making it very easy to, or very accessible. I think that's. I don't want to be too harshly critical of Sid Meier's and his collaborators. Sid Meier, so used to calling it Sid Meier's Civilization that I want to add an S there. I don't want to be too critical of that because I think he and his collaborators are not alone, right? There are tons of games that do this, and they certainly are to be, I don't know if celebrated, but given credit for not offering Hitler as a leader. But you're right to sort of raise the specter of, not the specter so much as the connection to, since the beginning, they've included these other problematic leaders. And we could, if we look at all the leaders, we can run into lots of issues with their conduct. No one, I would say, as horrible as Adolf Hitler, although competitive Olympics of atrocity purveyors is not something that's particularly interesting to me. So I think that would be one critique or comment I would make. I also think that even in Civ 6 with Frederick Barbarossa, right? He's got these various attributes. His unique ability is a militaristic one. The civilization, and in this game, if you're Barbarossa, you're Germany, and there's nothing else. The civilization itself has expansionistic tendencies built into it, right? That they can conquer city-states more easily. That you add into that this choice of Barbarossa is it does sort of skew towards the medieval period as you are in your game, or approximately in your game, and suggests that that's sort of in some ways, I think when the game does that, they sometimes tie it to, okay, that's going to be the time when you're really going to have your most powerful moment.
Right. Especially with the rise and fall mechanic, the golden age idea.
Exactly. But nevertheless, they want to include the Hanseatic League cities, this Hansa, which replaces not the commercial district, but the industrial district. Yeah. And so it comes in as I think both, yes, historically the label they've given it and the historical context they attach to it is medieval and early modern, but the mechanic is very much, this is the place that you want as many of your cities to have, I would say. Yes. If you're playing for almost any purpose, right? And it's very much an industrial. So you, again, yes, Frederick Barbarossa is your leader, but Germany is going to has this advantage that it can, and because you can get one extra district per city, you can afford to build an industrial, you don't have to make as many hard choices. So it still ends up creating a Germany that matches a sort of late 19th, early 20th, mid 20th century perception of a militarily and industrially powerful state or country or empire. And I think so. I think in Civ 6, there's some plus. Then the U-boat comes right at the tail end of that kind of phasing or historical phasing, or right in the middle of it. They didn't go with the Panzer, but that's not that important in the comparison. And they have in other ways, right?
Yeah.
So in other versions, so there's this sort of, I think that comes through, that they're still kind of setting you up to run the civilization to conform to general perceptions of German activities.
Yeah. And I've got a couple of follow-up questions for you here. I mean, one of them is more of a comment. You look at here at the entry for Germany here in the Civlopedia, and it makes some mention, well, there wasn't a Germany until Bismarck, and then it kind of goes into this medieval period. But then it never ends back up talking about anything that happens essentially after Napoleon, right? And so it's kind of this weird, very carefully worded document here to give you historical context for Germany. And then similarly, when you look at this U-boat entry, it makes a mention here of World War I, a very brief mention that, by the end of World War II. But then, 1955. So just kind of, I just accidentally kind of skipped over what had occurred during the Second World War. I look at this as a historian, I'm sure you do too, and say, I see what's going on here. And, that's the kind of the comment. And the question I've got kind of relates to your background with war games. And I'm wondering, when it comes to wargaming, obviously the Second World War is a huge, indispensable part of modern wargaming and the history of wargaming. And I'm wondering, kind of putting the developer's hat on for a moment, if you were developing a game like this, would it be kind of a gesture towards the wargaming community to include these kind of units that are associated with the Second World War, like you'd mentioned, the Panzer tank, Tiger tank, and the U-boat, as a way to say, hey, we know what you want out of this, but then when it comes to the actual Civ, kind of keeping that sort of buttoned up a little bit?
I think you're right. I think that there's and I know, and many of your listeners will know that there are sort of they're labeled as censorship rules, or there are standards and practice rules that Germany has as to representations of the Second World War and so forth. So some of this is the designers, and it's again not just in Civilization, having to work around certain rules to get access to that rich German market. But in war games, I mean, I think it is a sort of acknowledgement, and I think that for many consumers of Civilization, to avoid it is not. I think I would be disappointed if the game didn't have some way of acknowledging that part of history, with its claims to be a historical game where you can both change history, but you can also echo it and move in parallel to it. So I think it is very much a acknowledgement that they know that there are lots of players who are going to want to do what is the case in many strategic war games, but also in tactical war games, which is refight battles that should have been won, right? Or should be in the biggest scare quotes we can come up with. And you can see this again,
capital size scare quotes.
Yeah, exactly. And I think comparatively a lot of the time, and I think about there are many games for Waterloo, right? What if Napoleon could have won at Waterloo? What if the Operation Barbarossa could have been run the right way? Again, giant scare quotes in that. And that right way always leaves out, of course, the activities of the Einsatzgruppen and the massive violence in the partisan war, so which is linked they're intimately interconnected with the Holocaust in what was the Soviet Union, or territories from the Soviet Union. So I think that the interest in having World War II in these games is cannot be disconnected. And while Civilization offers other options, I think it's rare that I've played a game where I don't end up feeling either forced to or choosing to engage in some sort of program of conquest, either on a small scale or on a large scale, because it's pretty well known that at a certain point in the game, it sort of funnels you towards a certain pursuit of victory options. I mean, even to be really explicit, I just finished a game off last night where I was doing cultural victory, but the way that I finally got the cultural victory was by conquering the most powerful other civilization, because it was quicker to do that than to wait for the tourist numbers to flip.
No judgment. This is a judgment.
No, I don't. Yeah. I don't. I'm playing a game, but it certainly it's very hard not to have a military element to the game, and even sometimes to wish that. I think players will wish that the AI fought better.
Yeah.
Right. that you could fight a quote real war, and not just the sort of way you can outsmart them and maneuver them.
Yeah.
Right? So
absolutely.
Yep.
And Sid Meier himself revealed in his memoir that he likes to play as the Romans when he plays, and so that's very kind of another one of these original civs that has a lot of attributes and traits that are really military focused, and a lot of their leaders have that kind of military history. And with the Germans here, we've got Frederick Barbarossa, who you've already kind of hinted at as being kind of this kind of weirdly shoehorned in medieval figure into a civ that is most commonly thought of as kind of a modern state. Even the Civlopedia makes that argument. And past Civilization games have included Frederick the Great as the leader. Civ 2 gave you the option of including Maria Theresa, and then also, of course, Bismarck. It's kind of seen as the maybe by many players, I'm assuming, would see them as kind of the standard leader of this civ. So what do you make of Frederick Barbarossa as a representative figure for German history, but then also for this civ in this game?
Yeah, I think that one thing to this point, and I reread that Civlopedia entry, and this, like, there was no Germany, and there's kind of throughout the text in Civ 6, there's this sort of like, and I think this is some of the language of the Civlopedia at this point, but there's a sort of sardonic approach, and sort of like, oh, there's that some of these places couldn't be marked on a map if you could find a good map, and things like that, and these sort of this perspective that it is a point of German historiography that I can't be on a podcast and not make this point to anyone who's listening, that there is a Germany before 1870, and that there was a sense that people were Germans and lived together in some kind of country, some kind of state, that it didn't conform to sort of the normalized, sense that what France or perhaps the United Kingdom were doing, and we should problematize those as well.
Oh, of course.
But that there's no real Germany until 1870 is a false statement. Frederick Barbarossa, 300 years or so after him, they insert, German into the name for the official name for the Holy Roman Empire, right? That we are of the German people, right? Like, so there is some statement, right? So that's that. But Frederick Barbarossa, to your question about him, it's worth noting that on Civ 2, the male leader is Frederick II, not Barbarossa, but is a pretty important German king of the is it the 12th century? But I haven't spared a thought for Frederick II since I learned it in, I think, an undergraduate class about medieval Europe. So this is not a person with any presence in American or contemporary memory, right? Beyond people who might be, and I don't mean to throw any stones at people who study that period, but Barbarossa at least has a better chance of people knowing who he is, which I think is an important choice when it comes to a country like Germany, right? Where people are going to expect to know something about it. It's one thing to be playing a country that Americans don't know much about and teach them about the leader. But Frederick Barbarossa is not that. And then the medievalness, I appreciate that they looked elsewhere, right? That they thought, what other representation could we come up with? What other personality could we look to as inspiration? Bismarck, Frederick the Great, both of those orient you towards Prussia, towards the Frederick the Great was not king of any sort of pan-German or inclusive or wider German state, but certainly is in that history that we often learn. Whereas, and of course, Bismarck is the unifier, right? So, and then even the use of Maria Theresa is sort of this like, until they spun the Austrians off as their own civilization in 5, I think it was, that is this sort of greater German, which that is an interesting choice because Barbarossa is that as well, right? It's a Germany that is beyond the borders of 1870, right?
Yes.
And that's an interesting decision that the game presents him as a foreign, that German is foreign ruler in Italy, which is certainly that conversation is worth having, but it's a little bit, it's very sort of 20th, 21st century thinking. Yes. about states and how they functioned or governments. So that's one thing. I think in the actual things that Barbarossa says, when you meet him as a AI player, and the way he speaks, and his gestures, I think one of the ones that they do this task to make him a little bit comic, is when he introduces himself, he says, I am the king of, I don't have the exact scripting, but he says, I'm the king of the Germans, the Burgundians, the Welfs, and many other places. And he kind of just does this sort of like wrist roll, he sort of rolls his hand, it's no big deal. I think it's to me it plays as comic, which is fine, and I appreciate some humor in the game, but it plays into I think this thing I observe in American cultural attitudes towards Germany in our time is sort of to deal with the fact that we have this very scary narrative of German history, rightly so, right? These very villainous representations in actual history, to kind of make them less scary by making them a little bit silly. And so that he's this, they're depicting him in his I would say his middle age, and he's a little bit portly.
It looks a little bit like a ginger Santa Claus or something.
Yeah, and he's got this thick, bright red beard. I mean, he looks strong, he looks dangerous, but he also looks a little silly, right? And when he speaks and he does these things, you aren't doesn't have the same effect as some other ones. So I think that there's some choices being made there that are interesting, that tell us about how Americans and this is an international game, but how Americans and many others want to consume their Germans or their Germanness.
It is a international game. Many players around the world play it, but it is still one that is developed in Maryland. It's developed in the United States by a primarily American team. So I think you're right. It's still, in many ways, even though it's kind of diversified its cast of characters, even though it has made some changes with how it depicts the operation of civilizations and the conception of civilizations, it's still one that kind of presents a view of the world that I think, it fits in with the mold of, kind of grade school history that you get throughout the United States.
And I'm looking again at this, his leader page, and this that they use Holy Roman Emperor to talk about military strength, and to talk about that sort of that Barbarossa was a military leader, and like kings all across Europe, that was a core part of what he was expected to do. But it downplays some of the piety and the religious just cultural activity of Central Europe in this period, and this I think they may have And there's lots of things that go into design, but they may have missed an opportunity to think about the relationship between faith and power, faith and military power. That could have been a different direction to go with that. If you're going to use that label, which is a good one, right? Because it's got just as a byword or catchphrase for some ability, it's very evocative, right? People kind of know what that is, but it's got these 3 words in it that we don't always see together. I mean, we always see them together because we see them together, but they aren't words that come together in any other context frequently. And there's sort of that opportunity is missing, which also leads to this, the game, says the default religion will be Catholicism, which of course in Barbarossa's time, it's what it would have been. Although any scholar of religious history would point out that scholars call it the Roman Church until the Reformation, right? Because there is enough change that happens after that. But when people think of Germans and their religion, they just as much think of Lutheranism or Protestantism. And so I don't know how you shoehorn these things together, but there's a segue there to who else they could have chosen as leaders, right? Who else could have done this? And there's lots of directions to go. You could have, there is, it's essentializing to suggest that the Germans of 1850 are the Germans of 500 BCE, right? But there is some Central European culture and there are figures, Arminius and others that you could have done. I mean, if you're going to do Boudica, you could do one of these leaders, and you could really tie the Germans back to an ancient time, to the sort of time frame of the sort of into that group of Romans, Babylonians, Egyptians, Greeks, right? These sort of pre or late Iron Age at the best, right? In institutions. That's one thought. The other would be someone like Martin Luther, or if they want to avoid a specific religious leader, there are certainly other cultural figures that could have been contemplated. You could, if you're willing to do it in other places, you could do it with the Germans as well.
Well, following on that, my last question here is, as somebody who's an experienced Civ player and also a scholar, do you have any specific recommendations for the developers of Civilization going forward? I mean, I think we can expect the announcement of Civ 7 any month now, certainly within the calendar year. And so I'm wondering, Jeremy, do you have any specific ideas regarding either the Germans, like you had mentioned with leadership, or anything just in general about Civ itself?
Yeah, well, as I described, I came to Civ 6 a little later than I would have liked to, waiting for the opportunity to replace a computer and play the game as it's meant to be played. So I'm catching up on the news, and it was fairly recent news to me that Civ 6 was done expanding. 6 was basically done being expanded, that they were moving on to it a little bit late because of the delay in actually starting up with the game. And one of the things that disappointed me about that was the sense that I'd seen in looking at the leaders, and I sort of teased the game out to myself, right? I started with the basic game and then added the expansions, was that they seemed to be doing, and this was maybe just a misinformation from the Greeks, was they were doing a male and a female leader, that they were doing, at least doing some representation at least in a gender binary. And I sort of disappointed that, and it didn't always have to be a gender binary, but they didn't kind of go through every civilization and offer you 2 leaders to work through, right? And to really open up the ways, if you wanted to be, and as I've sort of suggested in this conversation, if you wanted to be the Germans of Barbarossa, that, as I've suggested, are not that different from what the Germans of Bismarck might be, then, or if you want to be the Germans of some hypothetical, 12th century bishop, right? Like, and pursue an entirely different path. I think that that was a missed opportunity, and I don't know if market, if the demands of marketing and programming drove that, or if they never really planned to follow through on what I thought was a plan. I think that was a disappointment, and I'd like to see them contemplate that more. I've really been impressed over the life of the game with the efforts they've made to acknowledge that civilization, at least implicitly or explicitly, civilization is not just a Western thing. there's all kinds of problems with that term because it is a westernized term, but that they've brought in civilizations in the game's terminology from sub-Saharan Africa, from South and Southeast Asia, from the Americas, that they've made this effort. I think that's important. And so continuing in that vein of finding ways to use this, I think a really powerful tool they have for history education, or at least history information, to find a way to kind of leverage that to help us a little bit, those of us in the historical profession.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was some talk several years ago about a program called Civ EDU that would, come up with ways to incorporate civilization into the teaching of world history, world cultures in, I think, high school, grade school level. But I don't know if anything ever came of that. I haven't read anything about it in the past 4 years or so.
I haven't. That's new information to me. I'm not surprised, because I think that there are many elements of the game that do convey a sort of basic understanding of what goes into state building or whatever. I think, but to think about my biggest point of critique, or place where I'd like them to think hard about it and talk to people about it, is this that the game has that it treats, I guess the best way to think of it is the place of fascism in the game. That we talked about World War II, and we talked about the Nazis and Nazi period of German history, but one of the ways, again, that they sort of evade that is by using the semi-generic term fascism. And in Civ 5, they call it order, right? This theme, and the game in its final stage, generally speaking, is pretty it's actually, theoretically, the game, you're supposed to be getting into the 21st century at the tail end of the game, but in that you're still locked into these government types that are 1920s, 1930s, like the three choices for modernity, right? You can be totalitarianism, what they call it in this one, right? You can be totalitarian, or then they've got suffrage, which is essentially the liberal democracy. And then they've got class struggle, which is the socialist, right, or the communist. And that argument, historians would say, perhaps is not settled, right? In fact, recent history shows it's not as settled as we thought it was. But that is a 1930s argument about how to organize the world. That then it's so this choice to include this, it continues to suggest to I think it suggests to consumers, and if we think of those people as almost students learning from the game, suggests that there's a trinary path that is just the natural way that the world was going to go and will go, and that it makes them all somewhat equivalent. And it suggests that there is, of course, a active argument about the equivalency of communism under Stalin and Nazism under Hitler, but there certainly isn't the same kind of argument about liberal democracies for all of their flaws and all of the crimes they've committed.
Exactly.
And I think this is another one of these ways where the game kind of opens the door to a little bit of cosplay, right? Which maybe it's just a game, right? And maybe it's just a game, but I'm not always certain it is just a game. And so being in this world we now live in, where so many people are consuming the world and learning about the world through digital media and through the internet, these kinds of spaces are ones that can lead to a fairly immature understanding of history and of the and of to be frank, of extreme right-wing ideologies. So I
it's a big reason why this show exists, honestly.
I don't know that the game could exist. They're in a tough spot, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they have intensive, deep conversations about this every time they come back to it. But it nevertheless is one that is probably worth having continuously and worth having uh, with experts, right? And I'm not pitching myself, right? Wanted to call me up, I'd have a conversation, but with people who know more about it than even the content designers on games usually do.
Yeah.
And a lot of these content designers, I want to backtrack that a little bit and be clear that I know they do a lot of hard research and they work really hard at this stuff, but that research can also include talking to other people and learning from them.
Yeah.
So
I do think it's interesting. We talked about this kind of steady progress and the way that it kind of cuts you off, at least in terms of government forms, into the modern era, when you get to things like suffrage and totalitarianism and whatnot. But it is interesting how this process, it kind of very closely mimics the tech tree and how the tech tree does the same thing. And, for many, many years, the kind of static response of scholars when they were considering civilization was to look at the teleology provided by the tech tree, the determinism provided by the tech tree. And that's been opened up, I think, quite a bit over the various entries of the series. But it is interesting to me that this kind of inclusion now of civics and governments and ideologies, it follows much the same model. And, maybe when it comes to the series, that the kind of ingrained design principles of Civ make it very difficult to break free from this kind of deterministic path into the future.
Well, and what they've done with, and I don't remember the vocabulary they use for it, but the various slots that you can fill in. Your government gives you a number of slots, but then you have policies. And I will say one of the critiques I would offer is that, these three governments that they give, the end game governments that really you have, and of course in this game they map onto there's always the militaristic one, the intellectual or cultural one, and the religious one, or they kind of, the religious one gets left behind a bit, but this sort of this three piece, right? Three piece structure. And what I was going to say is, after 1945, liberal democracy and socialism create some new forms that are different from the ones being offered in the 1930s. I mean, the most obvious one being the social democratic welfare states of Western Europe and the United States to a certain extent. And that they do these policy slots does make that at least some thinking in that range possible, right? Because you could say, okay, well, I'm going to do, I don't remember what they call it. I'm going to do I'm going to do this. Representative of this, what is it, synthetic democracy? I'm sorry, I'm trying to read on your screen.
Corporate synthetic technocracy.
Okay. Oh, those are the later ones. Yeah. So I'm going to do democracy, but I'm going to use some of these special powers that come through the communism path, and you can sort of achieve maybe some better. And I think that is a really strong gameplay innovation, and in fact, a reflection on that governments leaders make choices and within the framework they've got, right? And so you can sort of picture it. But no, the teleology of the game is always challenging. It of course is a colonial game. It's a colonial game. It is the 4X games are all colonial, and when we talk about ultimately conquest is inherent to whatever you're going to do. You have to actually sort of close off an entire set of tools to pursue that, to avoid it, I should say, and the game's sense that the Western technology path is the right technology path, and in fact it's the only technology path, right? There are no other technologies exist. That's part of the critique, that I'm not new to the table on that one. That one is a long-standing one, which I think is in some ways a good reason why some people reject the game. Right? Like they just reject it, and I can understand and sympathize.
All right. Well, on that note, I think that does it for this episode of Civs 101. Jeremy, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you, Bob. This was great. Really fun to talk about this game.